By the spring of 1944, Europe was collapsing under the weight of war. Cities were in ruins, fields burned, and the once proud German army was retreating on every front. The young men who still wore its uniform were hungry, frightened, and exhausted. When the Allied forces swept across France, thousands of Germans found themselves surrounded with no hope of rescue. The lucky ones surrendered to the Americans. The unlucky ones fell into Soviet hands. In the chaos of one final skirmish, an officer raised a white cloth on a rifle. "Kameraden," he said quietly, "enough. Lay down your weapons." A boy of 19 stared at him and whispered, "What will they do to us?" The officer looked toward the west. "Pray it is the Americans, not the Russians." The firing stopped, and silence settled over the shattered countryside. For those young soldiers, it felt like the end of the world, but it was only the beginning of an unexpected journey. Within weeks, long columns of prisoners were herded toward ports under guard. They expected camps somewhere in Europe, but soon a rumor spread that chilled and confused them. They were being sent across the ocean to America. "They say we're going to Texas," one murmured on the dock. "Texas?" Another laughed nervously. "I thought that was only in cowboy films." The voyage was long and heavy with fear. The men were packed into the holds of converted cargo ships. They slept on narrow bunks, breathing the smell of salt and sweat, speaking little. Some imagined forced labor. Others pictured electric fences and firing squads. "They'll make us slaves," one whispered. "My uncle said Americans shoot prisoners." But the older men shook their heads. "No," one said. "They are civilized, I think." Days blurred together. The ocean was endless. Then one gray morning the ship slowed, and a murmur ran through the crowd. Through the mist they saw towers rising out of the water, New York City. Even through the grime-streaked portholes, it took their breath away. The skyline glittered untouched by war. "No ruins, no smoke, no hubo." "They live like this?" a prisoner muttered. "No ration lines? No bombes?" His friend stared in disbelief. "And they call us the master race." From the harbor, they were loaded onto trains that rumbled westward across the country. At every station, curious Americans stood along the tracks to stare at the defeated enemy. Farmers, housewives, and children watched as the men in gray uniforms peered out through barred windows. In their faces, the Germans saw neither hatred nor pity, only curiosity. When the trains finally stopped, the prisoners were led through wide gates under wooden signs. "Prisoner of war camp." They braced themselves for cruelty, but it did not come. Guards handed out blankets, explained the rules, and showed them barracks with clean beds. "You'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention," a sergeant said. "Follow orders, keep discipline, and you'll be safe." One of the Germans whispered to another, "You'll feed us?" The guard gave a short laugh. "You're no use to us dead, son." The first meal stunned them. Real bread, thick slices of meat, boiled potatoes, and coffee that smelled like heaven. Many had not eaten that much in years. One soldier wrote later, "In the first week, I gained 5 pounds. I thought I was dreaming." In the mess hall, they noticed something else. The guards joked, sometimes even smiled. They treated the prisoners as men, not beasts. Outside the camp fence stretched endless fields of corn and wheat. There were no craters, no ruins, only sunlight and the sound of birds. Every morning trucks carried groups of prisoners out to nearby farms to work. They picked cotton, harvested fruit, repaired fences, and plowed fields alongside local men. "You boys ever bale hay before?" a farmer called. "Not in a uniform," one of them answered, and everyone laughed. At the end of the day, each man received a small wage, credits to spend at the camp canteen. When they first saw the shelves inside, they could hardly believe their eyes. Soap, razors, writing paper, Coca-Cola, tins of fruit, and something entirely new to them. Jars of peanut butter and silver-wrapped bars of Hershey's chocolate. A young prisoner held up a jar and frowned. "What is this brown paste?" His friend shrugged. "Ground nuts, they say." He dipped a spoon in, tasted, and froze. "Mein Gott, hey Vispiret. It's delicious." That night, he shared it with the others, laughing as they spread it on white bread. Later, someone opened a chocolate bar, and for a long time no one spoke. The rich, sweet smell filled the room. They broke it into pieces and passed it around. One of the older soldiers took a bite, closed his eyes, and tears rolled down his cheeks. "All my life," he said softly, "they told me Americans were monsters. But monsters don't give chocolate to their prisoners." When lights went out, the barracks were quiet. Men lay awake staring at the ceiling, tasting sweetness on their tongues, thinking of home. A few wrote letters their captors would later censor but never destroy. "Mother," one wrote, "they treat us well. We work and we are not beaten. There's even music on Sundays. America is not what they said. I wish you could see it." Word spread from camp to camp that the Americans were fair. Some guards traded cigarettes for handmade carvings. Others taught English phrases, and the Germans taught them songs. A farmer's wife who saw the work crews each day said to her husband, "They're just boys, polite boys." The man nodded. "Yeah, boys who got caught up in someone else's war." Slowly the fear faded. The hatred dissolved. For the first time since the war, many of these men felt human again. They began to smile without guilt, to laugh at small things, to dream of life beyond uniforms and orders. The same men who once followed speeches about conquest now found peace in the rhythm of farm work and the taste of unfamiliar food. The land they had been told was decadent, and weeks showed them generosity and order. The guards who should have despised them treated them with patience and humor. Somewhere between the rows of corn and the fences of the camp, a strange truth settled in their hearts. Perhaps everything they had been taught about America had been a lie. One evening as the sun set over the fields, a young prisoner leaned on his shovel and said quietly, "I think when this war's over, I will remember the chocolate more than the fighting." His friend smiled faintly. "Then maybe that's the beginning of peace." The sound of crickets rose in the warm air, and for the first time in years, the men allowed themselves to hope. By the autumn of 1940, for the rhythm of life inside the American prison camps had become almost ordinary. The German prisoners rose at dawn, ate breakfast in the mess hall, and waited to hear their names called for work assignments. Trucks rumbled out through the gates, carrying them to nearby farms or factories. The guards no longer barked orders. They spoke in calm, even voices. For men who had lived through years of shouting and fear, the quiet discipline of these camps was almost peaceful. Outside the wire, America looked impossibly calm. The war was raging in Europe and the Pacific, but here the fields stretched wide and golden. Towns stood unscarred, and people went about their lives as if the world were not burning. The prisoners worked in the sun and marveled at it all. "They have everything," one said as he loaded bales of cotton onto a wagon. "They don't even lock their barns." His friend nodded. "If only they knew how lucky they are." The Americans were cautious at first, but curiosity soon replaced suspicion. Farmers discovered that the Germans worked hard and followed orders. "You fellas know what you're doing," a farmer told them one day. "We try," a young prisoner answered with a grin. When the day's work was done, they sat in the shade drinking water from tin cups. Sometimes the farmers' children came to watch, peeking shyly from behind fences. "They look just like us," one girl whispered, "except for the clothes." Back inside the camps, life was filled with small routines that brought dignity back to the men. They played soccer on open fields, built furniture from scrap wood, and listened to the radio broadcasts permitted by the guards. The most popular place in camp, however, was the canteen. For the first time since the war began, the prisoners could buy things with their own earnings. Shelves were lined with soap, postcards, soft drinks, and small American treats. They stared at the bright labels as if they had entered another world. And then came the moment that would become legend among them, the discovery of peanut butter and chocolate. A prisoner named Ernst held up a small jar, turning it over in his hands. "What is this?" he asked, frowning at the English words. "Ground peanuts, they say," replied another. Ernst scooped a small spoonful and tasted it. His expression changed from suspicion to wonder. "Mein Gott," he whispered, "it's like heaven." Laughter broke out around him as the others tried it, spreading it on slices of soft white bread. The rich, nutty taste was like nothing they had known. "This is what freedom tastes like," someone joked, but his voice trembled. Then came the chocolate bars, thin rectangles wrapped in silver foil, stamped with the word Hershey's. The men held them as if they were sacred objects. They had not tasted real chocolate in years. Many had forgotten what sweetness was. They broke the bars into small squares and passed them around. No one spoke for a long time. When the first bites melted on their tongues, several of the men lowered their heads and wiped their eyes. Later one of them would write, "We cried, not from hunger, but because it showed us that everything we had been told about America was a lie." Another said quietly, "They told us these people were monsters, but monsters don't give chocolate to their prisoners." That night the camp was quieter than usual. A few men gathered under a dim light in the barracks, still holding the silver wrappers, as if afraid to throw them away. One wrote a letter home. "Mother," he began, "they treat us well. We eat enough, we work, and we even laugh. There is music on Sundays, and there is chocolate." Imagine that, chocolate from the enemy. The censors later blacked out the word chocolate. But enough of the letter remained for his mother to guess the truth. As weeks passed, the small comforts of America began to change the prisoners in ways no one expected. They started to see their captors not as enemies, but as men. When the guards discovered that some of the prisoners could play instruments, they allowed them to form a band. In the evenings, music drifted across the camp, German folk songs, American swing tunes, even Silent Night. The guards would pause on their patrols and listen. "They play beautifully," one said. "Hard to think they were shooting at us a year ago." Cultural exchanges began in quiet, simple ways. A guard lent a prisoner a newspaper to practice English. Another shared a photograph of his family. The German showed pictures of wives and children left behind. "Your little girl," a prisoner said, pointing, "she looks like mine." For a moment, the war seemed to disappear. One afternoon, when a guard cut his hand while unloading supplies, a prisoner rushed to bandage it. The guard hesitated, then let him. "Danke," he said. "You're welcome," came the reply. The prisoners learned to appreciate the fairness of the system that held them. They could earn money, write letters, and study. The Red Cross delivered books, and some men took correspondence courses through American universities. Others carved chess sets or built toys for the local children who sometimes gathered outside the fences. On Sundays, the chaplain held services in both English and German. The prayers were nearly identical. Only the language changed. "We ask for peace," the priest said, and the men nodded. Despite the barbed wire in the guard towers, a strange sense of freedom grew within those camps. The men were still captives, but the chains of hatred were falling away. They began to talk among themselves about what would happen when they went home. "Will they believe us?" one asked, "if we tell them how we were treated?" Another shook his head. "They will say we've been brainwashed, but we'll know." Winter came, and with it a hint of the Christmas season. Snow dusted the roofs of the barracks. Someone managed to fashion a small tree from pine branches gathered near the fence. A guard noticed and smiled. "Looks good," he said. The next day, he brought over a string of lights from the American side. On Christmas Eve, the Germans sang Still Nacht. Across the yard, the guards joined softly in English. For a few minutes, the language didn't matter. The melody was the same, the meaning shared. Later that night, a prisoner wrote in his diary, "I never thought I would spend Christmas in an American camp and feel at peace. Tonight we sang with the enemy, and I realized they were never truly our enemy at all." By the beginning of 1945, many of the prisoners had changed beyond recognition. They had gained weight, learned English words, and laughed easily. But the change that mattered most was inside. The bitterness that had driven them into war was melting, just like chocolate on their tongues. They still longed for home, but they no longer dreamed of victory. They dreamed of peace, of rebuilding, of seeing their families again. The sweetness of peanut butter and Hershey's chocolate had become more than just a taste. It was a symbol. It reminded them that compassion could survive even amid the worst of humanity. When spring returned, the fields outside the camp turned green again. The prisoners worked and sang as they harvested the first crops. The guards watched them and saw not enemies, but young men just like themselves. Somewhere between those shared labors and those simple tastes of kindness, the war had begun to lose its hold on them. What began as captivity was turning into something far more powerful, a lesson in what it meant to be human. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its end. Inside the American prison camps, the German prisoners could feel the change in the air. The guards seemed lighter. The radios played news that hinted at Allied victories, and letters from home spoke of cities in ruins, a defeat creeping closer. The prisoners gathered around the camp radios whenever permitted, straining to hear the words that might decide their future. Berlin surrounded. The announcer said one day. The men fell silent. Some bowed their heads. Others just stared into the distance. They knew it was over. For years they had fought, obeyed, believed. But now the dream of the Reich was collapsing, and all that remained were the memories of what they had lost. Life in the camps continued quietly, but now there was a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that the fighting would end, dread for what would come next. Many feared returning home. What will we go back to? One asked, sitting by the fence. Our houses are gone. Our families, who knows? His friend nodded. Here at least we eat. We sleep. We live. For some, the idea of leaving the safety of the camp was almost frightening. The Americans treated the prisoners the same as before, firm but fair. There were still rules, curfews, and head counts, but something in the tone had softened. Guards shared cigarettes more freely. Some even shook hands when the day's work was done. You boys did good out there. A sergeant said one afternoon after prisoners finished repairing a barn. If you weren't wearing gray, I'd hire you myself. The men laughed, and for a moment, there were no enemies at all. Then came the news that everyone had been waiting for. Germany had surrendered. The guards posted notices on the bulletin boards, and word spread from barrack to barrack like wildfire. Some men cheered quietly, others wept. A few dropped to their knees, whispering prayers. One soldier stood motionless, whispering, "It's over, finally over." The camp fell into an uneasy silence that night. No one celebrated loudly. The weight of everything they had done and lost pressed down on them. For the first time, they allowed themselves to think about the millions who had not come home. The next morning, an American officer addressed the prisoners. "The war in Europe has ended," he said. "You are now prisoners of peace, not war. In time, you will all be sent home." A murmur ran through the crowd. Home. The word felt foreign after years of fighting and captivity. They did not know what kind of home they would find. Weeks passed as the Allies decided what to do with the hundreds of thousands of prisoners still in America. Some were assigned to help with reconstruction work. Others stayed in the camps, waiting for transport. During that time, friendships that had once seemed impossible began to form. One farmer who had hosted work crews invited his German laborers to a farewell dinner. His wife served roasted chicken, vegetables, and pie. The men sat awkwardly at first, unsure if they were allowed to enjoy it. "Eat," the farmer said with a grin. "You earned it." As they ate, the youngest of the prisoners looked around the table and whispered, "When I go home, I'll tell them the Americans fed us like family." Letters from home were now full of sorrow. "Our town is gone," one wrote. "Father was killed in the bombing. We live with neighbors now." The prisoners read the words and felt a heaviness in their chests. They had been spared the worst horrors by being captured, but guilt began to take hold. "While we were safe here," one man said softly, "our people suffered." His friend replied, "Maybe being here was our punishment and our salvation." As summer turned to autumn, the camp life began to change. The fences were still there, but they seemed less threatening now. The guards and prisoners exchanged farewells, sometimes quietly, sometimes with laughter. One guard handed a German soldier a chocolate bar. "For the road," he said. The soldier hesitated, then saluted. "I will never forget this." Before they were shipped home, many of the prisoners gathered for one last evening together. They built a small fire in the yard and sang old songs from home. Some were joyful, others filled with longing. The flames flickered against a wire fence as voices rose into the night. One man pulled a small piece of foil from his pocket, the wrapper of the first Hershey's bar he had ever tasted. He smoothed it out carefully and tucked it back into his pocket. "A reminder," he said, "that kindness exists even in war." When the day came to leave, the trains were ready before dawn. The men packed their few belongings, letters, carvings, and small mementos from their time in America. As they lined up, the guards stood nearby, some offering handshakes, others quiet nods. "Good luck," one guard said. "You're free men now." The prisoners climbed aboard, unsure of what awaited them on the other side of the ocean. As the train pulled away, they looked back at the camp one last time. It had been a prison, yes, but also a place of rebirth. On the ship home, the men stood at the rails watching the waves. "What will you do when you get back?" one asked. "I don't know," another answered. "But I want to build, not destroy." Another added, "Maybe I'll find peanut butter in Germany one day." They all laughed quietly, the sound mixing with the wind and the sea. As the coastline of Europe appeared on the horizon, the laughter faded. They were going home to a country in ruins, but they carried something precious that no bomb could destroy, a new understanding. They had seen another side of the world, a place where mercy and strength lived together. One of them whispered, "They defeated us without hatred." When the ship docked, the men disembarked, thinner but wiser. Behind them lay a chapter of captivity that had turned into one of humanity's strangest stories. Enemies who had become students of peace. For years afterward, they would tell their families and children of that time in America, of the farms, the kindness of the guards, and the sweet taste of chocolate that had made grown men cry. And though they returned to broken cities and empty streets, they carried with them something that could not be bombed away. The memory that even in war, compassion can survive, and that sometimes the heart of victory lies not in conquering others, but in learning to forgive. When the German prisoners finally set foot back on European soil, the air felt heavier than they remembered. The docks were crowded with soldiers, refugees, and ruins. Smoke still rose from the cities they once called home. Streets that had been filled with life were now lined with hollow buildings, shattered glass, and silence. The war was over, but peace felt strange and empty. Families searched for one another in crowds, shouting names, clinging to photographs. Many of the prisoners returned to find their homes gone, their towns flattened, and their loved ones missing. For the men who had come back from America, it was like stepping from one world into another. In the camps, they had been fed, clothed, treated with dignity. Here, they face hunger again. "It's hard to believe," one man whispered, looking around the ruins, "that we once feared the Americans would starve us." His friend nodded sadly. "They fed us better than we can feed ourselves now." They shared what little they had, cigarettes, canned food, and the stories of their strange captivity in a land of abundance. At first, no one believed them. "You expect us to think the Americans were kind?" One man's brother scoffed. "You must have forgotten who you are." But the former prisoners insisted on telling the truth. They spoke of the clean barracks, the fair guards, the fields of wheat, and the sweet taste of peanut butter and chocolate. "They treated us like human beings," one said, "not because they had to, but because they wanted to." Some listened in disbelief, others in silence, unsure how to reconcile those stories with the destruction around them. As the months passed, the former POWs scattered across Germany. Some returned to rebuild their homes. Others searched for families or work. But wherever they went, the memory of their time in America stayed with them. They wrote letters to their American guards and farmers, sometimes receiving replies filled with warmth and friendship. A few even vowed to return one day, not as prisoners, but as free men. One man named Carl, who had spent 2 years in a Texas camp, found himself unable to forget the kindness of a farmer's family who had once shared their Sunday dinners with him. In 1949, after the new German government allowed travel, Carl scraped together his savings and wrote a letter to that same farmer. Months later, he stood again on American soil, this time by invitation. The farmer greeted him at the train station with a wide grin. "Didn't think I'd see you again," he said. Carl smiled back. "This time, I came without a guard." They shook hands, and the years of war seemed to melt away. That night, they ate together just as they had years before. The farmer's wife brought out a plate of chocolate cake. Carl laughed, tears in his eyes. "You remembered," he said. He wasn't the only one. Across the United States, countless farmers and townspeople remembered the German prisoners who had worked on their land. They had been enemies once, But by the end, they were neighbors and friends. Some had exchanged letters for decades, watching each other's children grow through photographs. It was a quiet legacy of kindness that history rarely recorded, but that lived on in the hearts of those who experienced it. In Germany, those former prisoners carried that legacy into their new lives. They became teachers, farmers, engineers, and fathers. Many of them taught their children lessons they had learned far from home. Never believe what hate tells you, they would say. We saw our enemies and found people. They introduced their families to new things they had discovered in captivity: coffee, soft bread, and even peanut butter. In the 1950s, when American chocolate and peanut butter finally appeared in German stores, many of those men smiled quietly, remembering the first time they had tasted it behind barbed wire. Some of them gathered in small reunions years later, sitting together and reminiscing. "Do you remember the day they told us the war was over?" one asked. "I thought my heart would burst." Another replied, "I remember the chocolate more than the victory." They laughed, not out of joy, but out of understanding. Time had softened the pain, but not erased it. "It's strange," one said. "I hated them once. Now I owe them my life." By the 1960s, several of those former prisoners had returned to America permanently, bringing their families with them. They built new lives in the same country where they had once been captives. One of them opened a bakery in Illinois, another a small construction business in Texas. They sent their children to American schools and taught them both German and English. To them, America was not just a land of their imprisonment. It had become a symbol of forgiveness, a place that had shown them the meaning of humanity. As the decades passed, their numbers dwindled. The men who had once stood behind fences grew old, their memories fading but never lost. When interviewed in their final years, many spoke not of battles or victories, but of kindness. "They gave us dignity," one said in his old age. "That was something the war had taken from us. And when they gave us chocolate, they gave us hope." One such veteran, now gray-haired and frail, sat in his garden with his grandson. The boy asked, "Grandfather, were you afraid when you were a prisoner?" The old man smiled softly. "At first, yes, but then they showed us something powerful. They showed us that mercy is stronger than hate." The boy was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you always keep chocolate in the house?" The grandfather chuckled, his eyes misting over. "Yes, my boy. It reminds me that even in the darkest times, there was sweetness." He looked out toward the sunset, remembering the sound of the camp gates, the laughter of guards and prisoners sharing food, and the taste that had brought him to tears so many years ago. He whispered to himself, "They defeated us with kindness." As the sun dipped below the horizon, his grandson reached into a small tin and handed him a familiar silver-wrapped bar. The old man unwrapped it slowly, broke off a piece, and let it melt on his tongue. For a moment, he was young again, standing in that barracks, surrounded by men who had once been enemies but had learned to be brothers. He smiled. History would record the battles, the victories, and the losses, but few would remember this quiet truth, that in a time of unimaginable cruelty, compassion had crossed the ocean, wrapped in foil and sweetness. The story of those German prisoners of war would fade from the headlines, but would live on in the hearts of those who learned from it. The men who returned home changed forever, the Americans who had treated them with decency, and the generations who grew up hearing that mercy, even in war, can heal more than hatred ever could. And so it ended, not with guns or glory, but with understanding. A story born of war that became a lesson in peace. The men who once cried over peanut butter and Hershey's chocolate carried that simple, human memory for the rest of their lives. For them, it was proof that even when the world falls apart, kindness can still rebuild it, one act, one meal, one piece of chocolate at a time.